This image here is an example of what different textures and drop shadows can do for your Cubist collage. So it just adds another layer of interest to your image, so it has that texture and then separates the images a little bit in an interesting way. With the texture, you can play around with the size, so making some of it larger, some of it smaller, just to vary the opacity as well and have some of those images jump forward and some get pushed further back into the image, so it creates a little more dimension. But here is the Cubist collage example that I'm working with. So once you have your collage put together, you're going to go to the right side of your images over here and double click on the different layers that you want to add the texture and drop shadow to. So on my picture, I'm going to start with this one on top here of the eye. So I'm going to click on the one I want selected. It will highlight it in the layers panel. And then I'm just going to double click off to the side of that layer. And there's a bunch of different settings, and you can definitely play around with all of these. But the ones that we're going to focus on for this specific video are texture and drop shadow. So I'm going to start with texture. On the right side, make sure that the preview box is selected so that you can see the texture added right away to your image. And then you can play around with a few of the different settings on here. So there's scale and depth. Scale is going to change the size of your texture, and depth is going to change the opacity. So images that are closest, or the ones that are on the top layers, should have a higher depth, or you should be able to see the texture a little bit better, versus pictures that are further back. So images underneath your layers, I would lower the depth so that they're a little more see-through to again show the depth within the image. As far as the scale goes, I would, same thing, play around with the scale for the different depths within the image. So layers that are on top, I would have a larger scale so that that texture shows up as being bigger versus images that are underneath. So I would do some of those with a smaller texture or a smaller pattern. There's a couple of different options here that you can choose from for the textures, so you can kind of click through those. A lot of them are on the simple side here for texture, so I definitely would try to find one that's not too much detail or doesn't do too much to your image, but just enough to kind of add that little bit of a twist that creates depth within your composition. You can also go and click on some of these different settings to create different textures with, and look for some different presets that way. I'm going to leave my texture set to this specific pattern and move on to drop shadow, which again just does a little bit to help separate some of the layers that you're working with. So I'm going to click on drop shadow, and you can play around with some of the settings here. So as I increase the opacity, it makes that drop shadow a little bit darker. So it's up to you how dark you want that image or you want that drop shadow to be. Something you can adjust, but the angle is something else. So as you slide this little line around the circle here, you can change the direction that your shadow is, and then the distance as well. And as you add these to the rest of your images, you're going to be able to keep the texture and drop shadow consistent. So it's not going to change from your previous setting, which is nice. And I'm going to keep it set here, maybe change the angle slightly so it's underneath as well. And then I'll hit OK, and I'll click on the next layer I want to work with. So I'm going to go with this picture that's underneath the one I was working with. So again, I'll double click on that layer. I'm going to select texture. It keeps it set to how it was before, but since this picture is underneath that top layer, maybe this time I will take the opacity down a little bit so you can see that depth. And then the scale, maybe I'll take the size down a little bit as well to really show that separation. And then I'll add the drop shadow. That keeps it consistent, so I'm going to leave the drop shadow where it's at. I'll hit OK and find another image to go back to. As you're working, I wouldn't add this texture to every single layer, so be careful not to overdo it at the same time. But play around with some of these different overlays. There's a lot, again, of different settings that you can work with, but just try not to get too carried away with it. So here I might make the depth a little bit further, lower opacity so that you can tell this one's further back in the distance. Maybe again lower that scale so that it looks further back as well, where you can see more of the texture. Then I'll hit OK. So just kind of go through, try to keep them separated so that everything is somewhat consistent with that drop shadow and the texture. This one, again, since it's the closest in the foreground, I'm really going to increase that scale so it's zoomed in, increase the depth so that it has the most texture. But again, you don't want one where it's completely just texture and you can't see what's going on behind it. So make sure that depth is still somewhat see-through as you're working. Then I'm going to hit OK. And again, here's the example where I have everything added. So you can see that the images are spaced out. There's some that are more see-through than others. So I don't have two really dark patterns directly on top of each other. They're all really spaced out as you're working.